Well, I want to welcome everyone here today. We are going to be talking about communication resolution programs and really the importance of them and as an emerging practice addressing patient harm. So as Nicole said, our speakers here today, Nicole, if you'll go to the next slide, are Rick Boothman, who has done a lot of work in this area, is well known for his work at the University of Michigan. We have Dr. Tom Gallagher, who, again, well published in the field of communication and resolution programs. Dr. Evan Benjamin, who is with Ariadne Labs out of Boston, and again, one of the leaders in the new PAC program that's out there, and myself, Carole Hemmelgarn. So we'll all be sharing different perspectives today with you about communication and resolution programs. Next slide. This is just our disclosure slide. If you'll go to the next slide, please. So what are our objectives we want to achieve today? Well, we want to understand the roles that CRPs play and how they're going to help reduce the suffering of patients, families, and clinicians after harm. We also want to look at the core elements of the CRP process. We want you at the end to be able to describe what are a couple of the things that make CRPs successful and what might those obstacles be that you run into. And finally, what is the good ROI of a reliable, and I want to emphasize reliable CRP process. What we're looking at now is our agenda for today. So I'll just let you read through that briefly. So let's go ahead and get started. When patients and families are harmed, their world is turned upside down. They went into your organization, be it an ambulatory care setting, a hospital setting, with the intention of either being cured or having an improved quality of life. The last thing they expected was to walk out of the organization harmed, or perhaps to not walk out at all. Often what they're met with is silence. Next slide, Nicole. This is one of the most damaging things to patients and families when they don't hear anything after harm from an organization. Next slide. Because what they feel is they feel abandoned. They don't understand why someone isn't reaching out to them, explaining. And one of the things I can tell you that patients and families feel is they can comprehend oftentimes the first harm. It's the subsequent harms of silence and not knowing. Those are the harms that are unacceptable when we can actually do something about that. Next slide. So patients and families believe in communication and resolution programs when they meet certain criteria. First of all, they need to be principled. They need to be comprehensive. They have to be embedded and systematic. But there's another one, they need to be compassionate. In the end, it's how they were treated that they will remember. Next slide. So what is it that patients and families want after they're harmed? Well, the literature will tell you there's four things. I actually believe there's a fifth. The first one is tell us what happened. And when we say tell us what happened, it's what we want to know. It's not what you think we should know or what you feel comfortable telling us. The second one is take accountability. You see, patients and families carry this huge guilt that they did not do enough to protect themselves or their loved one. So they need the organization, the provider, they need someone to step in and say, we own this. This is ours. The third is what I believe are the two most powerful words in the English language. I'm sorry. I'm sorry this happened to you. I'm sorry you suffered this pain. The fourth is tell us how you're going to fix the problem. I have yet to meet a patient or family member that's been harmed that one of the first things they say is, we want to make sure what happened to us or loved one doesn't happen to anyone else. They want to know that there's learning from this. Because if not, then the whole thing was just in vain. And the fifth one is let patients and families be part of the solution. If they want to come back to the very organization that harmed them or their loved one, you all need to look at that as a gift. It's a gift saying, we want to help you be better and we want to help you solve this. Next slide. What CRPs can do is they keep the connection. In the end, when patients and families are harmed, they need to find a place in their head and their heart where to put this harm. They need that connection. But then what they also need
The last time I did it,
trust again.
I had a hard time.
If I can ask everyone to mute your lines, please. They need to find a place where they can trust again. And that's where the gut comes in. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over now and let my colleagues talk to you about what CRPs are and why they are or how they are different.
Thanks, Carole. I represented health systems in Michigan and Ohio for 20 years. And throughout that time, everything that Carole just talked about was so evident to me, even as a trial lawyer. Asking countless patients on depositions, why did you see a lawyer? It was rarely, I want $1 million. It was almost always, I want to make sure this doesn't happen to somebody else. What we want to talk about, what I want to talk about right now is what are they and why are they different? Because I think there is a persistent misunderstanding, and it may come from the very caption or title that medical writers have given to this style of response to unanticipated clinical outcomes. Next slide. So I find communication and resolution an unfortunate label. Because as I've said on this slide, it erroneously implies that CRP is primarily a claims settlement device. Proactive and early claims resolution is nothing new in medical malpractice litigation. That alone is, it is an integral part of this in a principled way, but it is not primarily the goal of a CRP. And the second part of the label that I have heard from patients harmed in the course of their medical care repeatedly over the years is there often is no resolution for them. We can talk about mitigating the harm after they've experienced harm from an avoidable medical error, but we will rarely talk about a full resolution, and we need to acknowledge that going into this. So I'm just nervous about the label itself and hope that you'll get past that, because to really understand what we're talking about is actually a bigger landscape view of this. It honors even the injured patients who come to us and say, we don't want this to happen again. It says to us, if it happened to one, it can happen to others. We have a moral and ethical and common sense obligation to do our best to ensure that that doesn't happen. Next slide. So you can, I can go into organizations and in a minute understand whether or not they really grasp this difference, or what they're really doing is cherry picking certain claims for early resolution, which in and of itself isn't bad, but you miss a lot of the benefit of a true CRP. Organizations that focus mainly on claims will often ask this question: is this case defensible? And to the ears of a lawyer, that means something altogether different than it may mean to clinicians, and it certainly may mean something different to patients. In a true CRP, organizations stay clinical, and they look at this, at the care involved in a patient's unintended clinical outcome, and ask themselves, how did we perform? Did we meet our expectations? Did we meet the standard of care? because it really is true, we all know this, that you can do everything correctly and still have a poor outcome or an unintended or unplanned clinical outcome. That in and of itself doesn't determine what it is that we're talking about. But the language is remarkably different. Next slide. Organizations that are focused on claims often apply artificial restrictions, and they will, I've heard all sorts of boundaries. We're not going to talk to somebody unless they make a claim. We would never open the door to any compensation discussion unless a lawyer comes forward and asserts a claim. There are some reasons for this, having to do with insurance contracts and things like that. But I can tell in a moment, those organizations that are really focused still on claims rather than on something greater than that. And some even, as I've got on this slide, contrive extreme restrictions. We won't even acknowledge these patients. One organization in New York said to me, we won't even acknowledge these patients if what happened to them was actually covered on their consent form, as though the consent form was some kind of license to make a medical error and cause harm. Lastly, there is a remarkable persistence of harmful and I think and oftentimes cruel thinking from the risk management and defense perspective. This quote that I have here was from a client a couple of years ago, and I was stunned. I wasn't stunned that somebody was thinking that, but I was stunned that somebody was comfortable enough to say it in the presence of leadership. Next slide. So the key difference really is the driving motivation. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be motivated to do your best to make it right to a patient who has suffered harm from a medical error that shouldn't have happened. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But there are greater benefits if you see the bigger landscape. Next slide. So the essential operational elements really begin with notification of an unintended clinical outcome. And that in and of itself may seem a little perfunctory to talk about, but think about the status quo in too many organizations. Those patients don't even get seen until a claim is asserted. So for too long, medicine has accepted unplanned clinical outcomes and just chalked it up to the cost of doing business. In a true CRP, the goal is to get to the bedside regardless of whether the patient's injury is thought to be the result of a medical error or not. That in and of itself is a really important distinction. The next three boxes: stabilize the clinical environment and protect other patients and staff, support the patient and support the caregiver, all happen simultaneously, even before you have answers to what actually happened. Our goal is to get to the bedside immediately, reassure the patient that we are there for them. We're not going to abandon them, as Carole so poignantly noted. We're not going to abandon them because they've had an unplanned clinical outcome. In fact, our attention to them should be heightened. But just as importantly as those people are to us, the patients who haven't been hurt should be even more important. We need to understand that the first thing we should do is not wait for a claim to find its way through the system before we start looking at real clinical change, but immediately act to protect caregivers and other patients while we sort the pieces out. And thirdly, we have for way too long ignored the health of a caregiver. We know that the safety and health of our caregivers translates to better care. And we owe it to them if we're asking them to do dangerous work, that we will get our arms around them in the short term also. So I think that it is rare you would try to do a so-called disclosure or discussion in the first few minutes once you get to the bedside, but to pledge that that will happen is absolutely important. And then normalizing honesty. This isn't about a lawyer trying to manufacture a defense with malleable experts. We have all lived that. That's not what this is at all. This is coming to the realization that honesty is absolutely critical to the greater landscape, to moving a culture that is dedicated to clinical improvement. Sharing facts and conclusions openly with caregivers is really important, but it does take some discipline, and you have to know the difference between what you think happened and what you know happened. So managing those conversations with your patients and your caregivers is really important. And then the others all makes, hopefully will make some sense. We have measured, for instance, for too long, things like defense costs without making a distinction between defense costs that were incurred because of our mistake versus defense costs that were incurred because we didn't come clean with the patient right up front and explain to them why they don't have a case. So these things are really important. Medicine has been fragmented for too long, so that the idea of hardwiring improvements immediately and crossing the line between quality and safety and risk management and continual improvement needs to happen. There's no reason not to. Next slide. So importantly, what we really want, I mean, the true measure of success for me is whether or not, once we institute this, that caregivers understand that, not just caregivers, but even those like me, a lawyer, supporting the clinical mission, all understand that clinical honesty is really important, is critical to what we're trying to do, and is an honest trade-off to a patient who has just entrusted his or her life to us or our caregivers. We need to see defensiveness as counterproductive. Too often, defending care we're not proud of is actually counterproductive to all that we do in terms of trying to become high reliability organizations and that kind of thing. And then we need to act consistently. You can't talk about culture if you act in a transactional way, case by case by case. You need to treat every patient with equal honesty. Next slide. So I'll turn this over to Tom, I think, who's going to talk about the state of the CRPs nationally.
Great, thank you, Rick. And many thanks to Carole and Rick for getting us started in such a thoughtful manner. And it's great to see so many of you here today wanting to really learn about what communication and resolution programs are, because it's a time of incredible excitement in the field. I've been working in this space for almost 2 decades, and for a long time, you could count the number of organizations that were working on communication and resolution programs on 2 hands. And over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a widespread interest in adoption. We would estimate that several hundred healthcare organizations and many liability insurers are working to adopt some form of a communication and resolution program, which is great. We're seeing exciting spread of this model to a variety of care environments. Lots of folks wondered, can this only work in the big academic medical centers? And it can work in those centers, but we're learning it can work in community hospitals, in multi-specialty physician groups, in rural critical access hospitals, in senior living settings. There's not a single care environment that's not amenable to the CRP approach. Part of the reason why this spread is happening is that a whole host of new tools, really starting in some respects with the AHRQ Candor Toolkit, are now available to support high fidelity implementation and to couple CRP with quality improvement. There's also a lot of interest across a number of patient safety and quality software companies in trying to integrate the Candor or CRP process into their event management and reporting software, which I think would be a real help. And there are several CRP learning communities, the collaborative being one of them. There's a great learning community based in Massachusetts that Evan and Rick have been closely involved with, MACP, and others as well. This is also being supported by state laws in several states listed there that really try to create a supportive environment for CRP work. And I also am encouraged by the growing interest in trying to understand what are the policy barriers at the institutional, at the state, at the federal level. How do we address those? And how can we really incentivize organizations to develop highly reliable CRPs? The challenge, though, is on the next slide, and Rick has already hinted at this. The number one challenge I see the field facing is one of inconsistent implementation. Rick several times used the word consistency, the words discipline. This is really about it is what a CRP involves. So inconsistent implementation, using the CRP for some cases and not others, or using some but not all of the CRP elements for an individual case, is a real threat to the field because it fuels skeptics' concern that CRPs really are not about meeting the needs of patients and families. They're really not about improving quality and safety. They're really a claims management strategy. And that in turn raises doubts about really, are we committed to this culture of accountability rooted in the clinical mission that Rick has so thoughtfully described? It also raises concerns about things like, how does the data bank or state medical boards fit in here, and are cases reported when they ought to be? But ultimately, the big challenge of the inconsistent implementation is that when we don't use a CRP for each and every harm case, fewer patients, fewer families, fewer clinicians, fewer organizations benefit from the CRP process. And I would just echo what Carole said, which is, this is a choice. The harm may not have been a choice, but the inconsistent application of a CRP is a choice, or a series of choices that just exacerbates the suffering of all involved. It's a little bit like this gentleman who's at the false apology card section, trying to figure out which card he wants to get. I'm sorry you got mad. I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry, but I don't care. We want authentic, highly reliable, consistent, principled CRPs. And I'm going to hand things over to Evan Benjamin, who will start to lead us through the steps in the CRP process in much more detail, so you can understand what's involved in achieving that goal. Evan?
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you, Carole and Rick, for joining us today as well. We want to take this down to sort of the next level a little bit. You've heard sort of a high level of from my colleagues of what CRP is, how it's different. And now we really want to take you through some of the specific, what I call elements that are really necessary to have a successful CRP program. I had the privilege of co-chairing MACP. I'm a physician, I'm an internist, and when I was a chief quality officer, and then I came over to Ariadne Labs, and my goal there was really to say, how do we take this work that we've done, we've learned how to do this, and how do we begin to think about scaling it? And so part of this work today is trying to create a way to describe these essential elements and really facilitate to allow others to be able to take this work. You can go to the next slide. Well, it starts with culture. It really starts as probably the most foundational element and in many ways a prerequisite before launching a CRP. Lucian Leape said the single greatest impediment to error prevention is that we punish people for making mistakes. This is really sort of sums up for me what a culture needs to be in an organization. And you've probably heard some of these things. Probably many of you have been working on culture. It really includes having psychological safety within an organization, that people feel comfortable asking questions, challenging one another, where there's transparency already around performance as well as around error. There's continuous learning that's going on in an organization. It's a profound culture where there's knowledge sharing, what we call a just culture, a culture which really looks at systems as well as looks at individuals' roles in those systems. And these together sort of make this a culture for reporting and a culture that would be foundational to be able to do CRP. Next. Culture really is, just to echo some of the things that Rick had said, it also means that there's a real focus on patient-centeredness. It means that we're notifying each other as well as patients about any unintended clinical outcomes. We're not waiting for claims. We are focusing on really asking what was the clinical outcome and what happened. And this idea, which is all driven by this concept that Rick had mentioned, if it happened to one, it could happen to others. But the focus is really on the patients and what we can do about learning about what happened and how do we prevent this from happening again. Next. So the next foundational element in a CRP is really good event reporting. You need a culture that promotes that reporting, but you really need to be able to have an organization that has a goal that is to increase the reporting of all patient harm. That is really absolutely necessary. So this culture of reporting exists. We want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable in reporting, that they're trained in it, and that there's rapid and timely reporting that goes on, and that there's good documentation. Some organizations want to make sure also that they can manage anonymous reporting. Most event reporting is tied to an individual who reported it, so there can be questions asked, but also that there's a process in place if, in fact, anonymous reporting occurs. So this is really essential. The next is, thank you, is an event reporting system really must have the ability to support, a rapid response on harm events. It has to be able to engage providers, to allow for confidential reporting. It also needs to protect an organization to ensure that an event analysis is not discoverable. And finally, it needs to really provide feedback to those who reported to help the staff feel that they were part of the process and that they were part of the solution. Next slide. So the next step in a successful CRP program, we've talked about culture, reporting, is really the event analysis. Now, these are sort of rough guides. They're more averages than they are goals. But within the first 3 days after a harm event, that there's an investigation which is initiated, interviews are occurring, records are reviewed, a notification to a liability insurer occurs. And then really within 4 to 6 weeks, the investigation should really have been completed to allow for the determination of causal factors and violations of standard of care. This is sort of the high level of the event analysis. Next slide. But the analysis of the event should also be very systems oriented, right? It's not focused on individual blame. It's focused on a systems orientation. It includes a root cause analysis to understand the system drivers of the event. Again, trying to understand, was there a violation in the standard of care, and did harm occur as a result of that violation? It's to really come up with consensus recommendations on the causes, the preventative action solutions, and to understand what was the violation. Those are all the components of that event analysis. So let me pass that on now back to Tom to talk about the steps in communication with patients and families.
Thanks, Evan. Communicating with patients and families after harm is really pivotal. And for a long time, folks wondered, well, why is it that clinicians struggle so much to communicate with patients and families after harm? Some doctors take unusual approaches. Here's a doctor who's come out of the operating room with his guitar and he sings, "Listen up, my fine people, and I'll sing you a song about a brave neurosurgeon who done something wrong." Well, I would not recommend that any of you take this singing neurosurgeon approach. But for a long time, folks wondered, why are clinicians struggling so much to have these conversations? Maybe they're not sufficiently committed to openness. And so some of our early research was really looking at this issue and found that that's not the case. Physicians' commitment to openness is strong. Where they struggle is turning that commitment into practice, the skills that are involved. And part of the reason this is so hard is that we all have natural reflexes that can either support or inhibit effective responses to patients and families after harm. Think about when you personally have been involved in something that's gone wrong. That natural inclination we all have to think, do I have to tell anybody about this? Maybe if I just sort of lay low, this is all going to blow over. Some of those reflexes are helpful. Our desire to want to share information and comfort the patient and family, apologize, prevent it from happening again, but some of them are less helpful. The urge to want to keep information to yourself or to rationalize, well, maybe it wasn't that bad, to minimize, to blame, this wasn't really my fault. Understanding those reflexes and how to minimize the inhibiting ones and maximize the supportive ones is a large part of what needs to happen as we think, how do we communicate effectively with patients and families after harm? Patients and families also have some of these reflexive reactions that we need to understand and take into account. But fundamentally, our obligation as healthcare workers is to respond to harm events in ways that support patients and families rather than traumatize them further. But the limited data suggests that we struggle to do this well. So on the next slide, several years ago, we partnered with colleagues at COPIC, who's a liability insurer in Colorado, and looked at 800 harm events and asked doctors and patients to rate the effectiveness of the conversation that happened about harm. And you can see some of the data on the next slide. This is presenting a 0 to 10 scale of how well you think that conversation went, 0 being extremely low quality, 10 being extremely high quality. And you can see on the left, physicians think we're doing a pretty good job of these conversations. We give ourselves 8s, 9s, and 10s. The patients on the right in the green have a different opinion. Over half of the sample rated the quality of the conversation as a 5 or less. In the education space, they talk about this as a portrait of unconscious incompetence. We're not skilled at these discussions, but as clinicians, we don't know, we don't recognize that skill deficit. And so on the next slide, we just highlight the importance of training frontline clinicians in an effective response to harm. And it starts immediately. So those reflexes that we have can lead even well-meaning clinicians to make offhanded comments right after a harm event that can set the stage for everything that follows. So at one organization, I heard of a case where right after a patient fell, as the nurse's aide was helping them up, they said, I've told them the lighting by the bathroom door is too dim. From that moment on, that patient and family were convinced that this was a design flaw that led to the fall, when in fact it turned out not to be the case. Or the nurse who says, I paged the doctor again, hopefully we'll hear back soon. Right? If something doesn't go well, if you're the patient and family, you're likely to attribute this to the failure of the specialist to arrive in a timely way. And once these conversations get started off on the wrong foot, it is very, very hard to regain trust with patients and families. So there's a high premium to be placed on getting these initial conversations right. And part of it involves overcoming the barriers both real and imagined. For many, many years, everyone thought, well, the real problem here is fear of litigation. And we showed in several studies that that's not the case. In fact, I'm not saying that clinicians don't worry about litigation. They do, but if you put them in environments where being sued is much, much less common or actually doesn't happen, they still really struggle with this process. There are misunderstandings of what patients want, especially in cases of delays. People will think, well, it will just upset the patient to know we're not going to change our clinical treatment plan at all. It would be harmful to the patient to know. When we know from multiple studies of patients and families, that's not the case. Clinicians don't have confidence in their communication skills or get mixed messages from institutions. But I remember early on in this work, Lucian Lee pulled me aside and said, Tom, this is not about shame. This is not about fear of litigation. This is about shame and embarrassment. And having to have more than my fair share of conversations with patients and families about harm events, I can attest that that's a powerful, powerful barrier. So when we think about approaching these conversations, think about three basic buckets. Patients and families have needs for truthful, for accurate information. Evan highlighted how a thoughtful process is needed to get accurate information. They need emotional support, including an apology, and they need follow-up. And for some harm events, potentially compensation. Clinicians have needs. They have needs for support in these conversations, and they need their own emotional support, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And much to the chagrin of clinicians who would like just to be able to go in and have one discussion and be done with it, this is a process. The process of rebuilding trust with patients and families takes place over time and involves multiple conversations. But when we look at organizations and clinicians, the biggest mistake by far that's made in this area is the lack of planning and preparation for these conversations. Those reflexes that I mentioned will lead you astray if you don't take the time to really think carefully about how are we going to have these discussions, and think about on the next slide some of the do's and don'ts. We should always acknowledge that something unexpected has happened, but suggesting that what happened was due to an error, unless that's clearly known, which oftentimes takes considerable time and analysis, is not helpful. We should be sharing the facts about what is known, but not speculate, even when pressed. There's such a tendency to want to speculate because you have an upset patient and family. You want to tell a coherent narrative about what happened. The family or the patient is saying, well, please, what do you think might have happened? But the speculation, when it leads to sharing information that's inaccurate, really does more harm than good. The focus ought to be on expressing empathy, verbally acknowledging and validating patients' and families' emotions. Instead, clinicians often ignore emotion because it makes us uncomfortable, or we shift into our problem-solving mode, or let's move forward, let's focus on the positive. And patients and families end up feeling like, you just don't get this. You don't get this at all, do you? That focus on the patient and family perspective, and Carole will share more about that in a few minutes, is essential. But again, it doesn't come naturally because clinicians can be so overwhelmed about what happened that they focus on themselves, they focus on the impact to their reputation, what's going to happen to the organization. Even in the micro setting, they focus on what am I going to say next, when they're really actually not listening all that carefully to what the patient and family are saying. So keeping the patient and family front and center is key. Providing expressions of sympathy and describing the process that will follow are equally as important. So I learned, in the next slide, please, Nicole, I learned, that's great. I learned about this second issue of supporting clinicians, which is another vital element of a communication and resolution program. I learned about it the hard way. I was a resident. I was in the CCU. We were rounding. I had admitted a patient the night before who had coronary artery disease and chest pain. We thought he had unstable angina and had given him the appropriate treatment for unstable angina, which was treating him with heparin, a blood thinner. And while we were on rounds, the patient abruptly coded and died. A horrible event in and of itself. But not long thereafter, we got a phone call from the attending radiologist who was reading the films from the night before when patients were admitted. I had looked at the patient's chest x-ray. I thought it looked okay. The radiology resident had looked at it, thought it looked okay, but the attending was calling to say, your patient's having a massive dissection, a massive tear in his ascending aorta. And when we later looked at the films, it was obvious. We were just inexperienced. We missed it. And clearly the last thing you would want to give a patient who's having a massive dissection in his aorta would be a blood thinner. And we thought carefully about what to say to the family that was out in the waiting room. But the thing that I wanted to point out here is really what we did with our emotions. We felt profoundly upset, fearful, disappointed, afraid. And what we did was we put our heads down and we moved on to the next patient. Never talked about that case again. Wasn't even discussed in M&M. That turned out not to be a particularly constructive strategy for me. And certainly you would not want to have been the next patient or family that we rounded on. I had the idea in my mind that if you're a professional, for lack of a better phrase, you just kind of have to suck it up. This is what being a doctor is about, I guessed, and didn't really talk about it or think about it. Communication and resolution programs recognize on the next slide that care for the caregivers is essential, not only to support clinicians and their emotions. Supported clinicians have a more effective at interacting with injured patients and families. They're less likely to make mistakes. We know the rate of errors increases after harm events when clinicians aren't supported. And it's horrible to think about, but there are situations where distraught clinicians have actually taken their own lives. So one of the most, I think, worthwhile elements of communication and resolution programs have been the development of formal programs for care for the caregiver, sometimes known as peer-to-peer or peer support programs. And there are a variety of outstanding resources to support clinicians after care has gone wrong. But a communication and resolution program is really incomplete without a thoughtful and systematic way to reach out to a resident like me and proactively ask them, how are you doing? Would you like to talk? So I'd like to pass things along now to Rick Boothman to talk about another essential element in the CRP process, which is resolution. Rick?
Thanks, Tom. Nicole, next slide. I was at the National Press Club with Dr. Leap many years ago, and he made this statement, and it obviously stuck with me all these years. When we, in any field, when we look at the question of apology, whether we're talking about medical malpractice kinds of issues or otherwise, understand that if our goal is to become accountable, and by being accountable, we will advance the clinical mission, we have to be accountable all the way through, not just when it's expeditious or expedient. We need to be able to see it all the way through, and that includes doing our best to try and make the harm right in a principled way. Next slide. So resolution, again, in this context, doesn't mean that we can sponge away all of the harm that was caused to a family or a patient. They may never achieve full resolution, but it does go a long way to mitigating the harm. The Betsy Lehman Center did a really thoughtful study of patients who have been harmed and divided them between the patients who went through a CRP resolution type program and those that didn't. And I always told patients, when I talked to probably more than 1,000 patients in my career, that money will never fill that hole. But it is an expression. Money is a proxy for so many other things. And it's not the only way that we can approach resolution. We can approach resolution perhaps even in more profound ways by reassuring a patient that their injury didn't happen in vain, that we have confidently learned a lesson and will protect future patients. Resolution in this context is thought in a very broad way. Next slide. But to really understand these things, you start again with what causes most patients or what drives most patients after they get hurt. And I fully agree with Carole that there are 5 things, but the 3 things that come up the most often are, first, acknowledgement. Just, am I seen as a patient? Do you understand that what happened has now changed my life? Secondly, that you own whatever you should own in what happened. And then lastly, set my mind at ease that you're going to learn from this. You're going to help me help you get better and make sure that others don't get harmed. If you understand and embrace those, at least those three components, much of the CRP process starts to fall into place. Honesty is not the same as transparency. Honesty is the first step to be able to look in the mirror and acknowledge that you could have and should have done better. Transparency is then operationalizing that honesty. So how can you get better if you are defending care that secretly you're really not proud of? But by the same token, we ask our caregivers to operate in an inherently dangerous environment, and not all unplanned outcomes are the result of a medical error or an avoidable medical error. So we need to be principled if we're going to move this forward and have credibility with both patients and with caregivers as we move forward. Every patient who suffers harm, regardless of whether the harm is the result of an avoidable medical error or not, deserves our compassion, deserves our support, staying in the saddle with those patients, not running away or circling the wagons and isolating that patient. They deserve our best clinical efforts in the continuation of that patient-caregiver relationship. One of the most gratifying things of our experience at the University of Michigan was the sheer number of patients who continued their caregiver-patient relationship because of the trust that we built even after an error caused harm. And everybody should be entitled to a full and honest explanation. It seems odd that we talk about normalizing honesty in the context of a profoundly trustful relationship. Next slide. So operationally, to do this, you have to be principled. You want to isolate the harm caused. For instance, if a patient is having surgery and something went wrong, not everything related to the patient's condition may be related to the error. So the goal is to isolate the harm that we caused, but it will always be an art, not a science. By definition, our ability to, quote, make it right will always be fundamentally flawed or insufficient. You cannot pay for that harm. You can't cut a big enough check and sponge away the memory or the trauma of the harm, but we do our best given imperfect tools. I think minimally, any resolution effort has to at least contain these 5 components that I've listed. We used some of the best life care planners and healthcare economists in the country to try and make an evidence-based guess about the value of or the financial cost of the harm that we caused. If you are financially motivated or claims motivated, you may be looking to steal a case. When I was a brand new lawyer, I literally got a case of a birth trauma that had happened 10 years before. So in 1970, some people were harmed, and a claims person had the family sign a release for the outstanding hospital debt, rather than, and I'm sure they were doing high fives in the hallway that they had just settled a shoulder dystocia case for $12,000 and change. That kind of thing can happen if you're financially motivated. Your goal should be to be accountable across the board. If you should be at the table, you should be able to put a price tag at least as close as you can to it. Next slide. So that's it in a small nutshell for resolution. Obviously, we could spend almost a whole day on that, but I'll turn that over now to, is it Carole coming next?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. So where is the patient in this? Well, there's a few things that I want to touch on. One, as I said, we want to be part of the solution. And this means that when you're doing your event reviews, next slide, please, you have to get the narrative of the patient and family. They are the only ones there 24/7. They're the only ones that see the full picture of the movie. Providers come in and out and they see snippets. So when you're thinking about how you're going to implement this and do it correctly, as you've heard all the other speakers say, if you're not capturing and talking to the harm patients and families, you're going to be missing something. And what this really ties into is the learning. If there's anything you take away from what we're talking about today, is that we want to make sure you learn from this. And why I am so passionate about this is because I lost my 9-year-old daughter to multiple medical errors. And it took the organization where she died 3 years, 7 months, and 28 days to have the first honest conversation with me. And I have thought over the years how many other patients and families were potentially harmed because we did not learn what was going on. It was a missed opportunity. Next slide, please. I can tell you years later, I now sit on that very organization's board for quality and safety. There are opportunities to repair these relationships. It doesn't come easy, but it's when you find that you have a common goal, and that is to make sure that you're a learning organization, you're a principled organization. So many of the things we're talking about, you can have harm patients come back and be embedded and drive the work that you do. So that's why I'm so passionate about CRPs, because I didn't have it. And there was a lot of loss and hurt and harm that went on because they weren't originally a learning organization. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over now to Evan.
Thank you very much, Carole. I think, Carole, you speak, from the heart for this, and I think it's the reason, why we're here, and it's so appreciative to have that perspective and to keep that in the back of our minds as we do this work. But this is hard work. How do you actually implement something? We've spent a lot of time trying to think about what does implementation mean, and to do implementation. Not only do you have to have your changing workflow, which is really hard to do. So you need to have a good idea of why you want to change the workflow, but you also need a good implementation, and you need to do it at a place that's ready to take this on. And that's why we keep talking about, what are the steps? And now to think about how to implement really means we need a good understanding of the readiness of an organization. So there's sort of 4 things that are really important when you are at a time where you want to implement a CRP. One is around leadership, and I'll talk more about that and their engagement. The second is around understanding the context and readiness for adoption, and I'll talk about ways to do that. The third is to use metrics so you know where you're going. And the fourth is incorporating it into the workflow. It's really around high reliability. Next slide. We created a framework to illustrate and also to measure these essential elements that really need to be satisfied to successfully implement a CRP, but also, really to implement any quality improvement initiative. There are 5 domains in this framework. There's the role of leadership, there is measurement, there's the culture and the context, and then there's the processes. And all of this is on this foundation on person-centeredness, which is really around how to engage people and patients in the work that's being done. Next slide. So what do these mean? Well, leadership really means that there is, first of all, people believe in this. They're committed to it from the top down. We talk about making CRPs part of the mission of an organization. This isn't, downstream that's done in a quality or risk management department, but really leaders are committed to this, and that there's a governance model for it as a result. Where does it sit within the organization? Who's accountable for it? And to really show the prioritization and the commitment, but also to create the leadership strategy that goes all right up to the board. So leadership is so important. The culture and the context, the culture I talked a little bit earlier about, those foundational elements of a culture of safety, the psychological safety, transparency. The organization needs to be ready and to have all those in place. The context is really understanding where things are done in an organization to make sure that we're implementing this, that it's adaptable to the local context. And everywhere I go and see different organizations, I see there's a quality department, there's patient relations, there's risk management, there's claims, sometimes very different departments. Understanding that and understanding who does what becomes very important in this. Next slide. The other elements of the implementation framework include the processes, which is really another way of saying of understanding the workflow, right? Putting together using high reliability principles so that a CRP process is initiated every time, not selectively, but it becomes embedded, it becomes hardwired that this is our approach to managing unexpected outcomes and harm. And that we're engaging both leaders and front lines in hardwiring that. Measurement, I'll talk more about in a second, the importance of that, and then really patient-centeredness. When we do quality improvement initiatives in many fields, we see that the most successful implementations are those initiatives that have actually engaged with patients, are almost co-produced with patients and advisors and patient families advisors along the way. Next slide. So the metrics are so important. We have believed that metrics really provide an opportunity to see how you're doing, to actually compare yourself to others, but to really help guide the implementation and to look at where you're failing and where there are opportunities for improvement. We had the opportunity, Tom and I had the opportunity to create, on the next slide, a set of measures that we had experts from around the country come together. We put together a set of measures and then we tested them at 5 centers. And there were 4 domains to these measures. They fall into these buckets of what's the environment for CRP. So we talked about a culture of safety and how do you measure that? And also just the total number of adverse events in an organization. So what's the environment that we're implementing this in? The second is around some specific steps for CRP, around timeliness, around event analysis, the putting in place of a peer support program, and then understanding the resolutions, all the steps that we've just talked about. The managing serious safety events is another bucket. How well we do around communication and systems improvements. And then the last are these outcomes, really looking at the number of claims, tracking costs, and then understanding patient and provider experience. Go ahead to the next slide. The idea behind having metrics, though, is just to make sure everyone's on the same page, that you're defining things the same way and you're measuring them the same way within an organization. And we believe to advance this field, writ large, for getting every health system to be doing proper CRP, we need to have standard definitions across the table. So in our pilot test, this was under that domain of the CRP environment, where we looked at the number of events at an organization. We had these definitions of what's a CRP eligible event, what's a CRP actual event, that's where how many of those eligible events are actually used in the CRP process, and then what's a serious safety event. So standard definitions. And then what we're doing on the next slide is, as we work with organizations, we're creating a dashboard that they can see over time how they're doing in these buckets around their culture of safety, their adherence of actual CRP cases compared to eligible cases, what's happening in terms of their steps, how they're doing in terms of reporting and event analysis and resolution, how they're doing in terms of managing safety events and their outcomes, particularly around, are they hearing about cases, or are there new claims that are occurring without their knowledge that they can track, as well as the experience. So this is when you think about good implementation, it really requires to come together, to have leadership on board, to have good metrics, and to really understand the context of an organization to implement in place. So I'm going to turn it over now to Rick to just comment on some of the lessons that he's thought about and seen in various implementations.
Next slide, Nicole. Thank you, Evan. I've harped on this a couple of times, but prioritizing the larger landscape is really important. It is nice and it is good to have a meaningful discussion with a harmed patient, but it's even better to protect and advance the quality of healthcare across the board based on that experience. So prioritizing the larger landscape is really important, but clinical leaders have to be engaged. And this may seem kind of a trite thing to say, but in 20 years of representing some of the finest healthcare organizations in Michigan and Ohio, not once when I was retained to represent them, did anybody ever say to me, be careful what you choose to defend. Because if you defend care we're not proud of, it's counterproductive to everything else we do. We can't ask middle-level people, say a director of risk management, to do what we have been conditioned to believe is completely counterproductive without having the clinical leader in the organization or the clinical leaders in the organization say, this is really important. To be consistent and to treat patients the same all the way through the continuum is really important for us to move our culture to a place where we are committed to the patient, we are patient-centric, and we're committed to clinical excellence. Next slide. So the critical importance in understanding it is that all patients are treated with equal honesty, and the continuum of the relationship is characterized by that consistency. We're looking for an accountable culture. We're looking to see this spill over into things like peer review. We're looking to, you can't speak to patients harmed over and over again without seeing value in changing the way you do informed consent, without seeing a whole host of other ways you can improve your clinical care and clinical care delivery. Next slide. So the key effects of a CRP are that you move things quicker. This old idea that we will not change anything, we will freeze it all, the status quo, until the resolution of a claim, sometimes years in the making, puts other patients at risk. And that makes little practical sense, let alone it's offensive to ethical and moral imperatives. So moving quickly to prioritize the clinical care improvements is really an important key effect of this. But all of these other things, Carole mentioned the importance of securing the patient's reality just to get a richer root cause analysis. What valuable information has been lost because we have partitioned off the patient from that whole process. Being able to collect their reality and then build it into the immediate RCA is far more important than worrying about some deleterious impact on a single medical malpractice claim. Evan talked a little bit about the importance of reporting, and I can't emphasize this enough. When a healthcare staff realizes that not only will they not be penalized for speaking up, but that good things will happen, it causes an amazing cycle of improvement in reporting. If your healthcare staff on the floors understand that good things will happen by reporting, your reporting will go through the roof. And that will raise other logistical problems. At the University of Michigan, when I retired from there in 2018, we were drawing more than 40,000 reports a year. It's an incredible number, and how do you find the pearls and all that? That's another discussion, but that's just a graphic example of how healthcare providers who believe that good things will happen by reporting will rally to that cause in a minute. And the one thing that we haven't measured very well is the joy and meaning that caregivers feel when they know that they are working in an organization that is principally based and dedicated always to the patient. One of the best compliments I ever had was indirectly when one of our maternal fetal director at the University of Michigan told an interviewer from the BBC that when he was asked, how has this changed his approach? He said in high-risk pregnancy, he had always trained residents in defensive medicine, but now that he knows that the organization will be principled in the way we deal with patient harm, he can now talk mostly in evidence-based medicine. It's an incredible change if you make that transition. Next slide.
So you've heard a lot about communication and resolution programs. What are they? They're a choice. They're a choice to adopt a comprehensive, a principled, a systematic approach for preventing and responding to patient harm. They're fundamental to the clinical mission. They need to be considered mission critical to the organization. They need to be supported by and infuse a culture of clinical accountability. That's what a communication and resolution program is. And I hope that you are thinking about your questions, because in just a few minutes, there's going to be an opportunity for your fingers to be furiously typing and sending questions in via the chat. But first, I have a couple of questions for Carole and Evan and Rick. And I'm going to ask them to, in 15 to 20 seconds, share their response to three questions. And we'll start with the first question. What's the biggest misconception people have about CRPs, and why does it matter? Carole, we'll start with you.
So Tom, from the patient and family perspective, I think it's a lot around cherry picking, you know, that their case may or may not go through a CRP process. So I think, like we've said in this, it has to be consistent across the board if patients and families are going to believe and trust in communication and resolution programs.
Thank you. Evan, biggest misconception and why should we care?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that this is all about risk management or med-mal insurance. And this is an initiative that it happens up in the corporate office, and they can take care of it. When this is really about patient safety. This is really about us being learners about everything that happens, that be transparent, and it means that we're taking care of our patients. And the misconception is it's a risk management initiative. And I think it's so important we think of it much more broadly.
Rick, biggest misconception and why does it matter?
I would echo what they both said, maybe put a little bit different spin on it. And that is the biggest misconception is that we only are honest and we only engage patients who we think have a claim. The goal is to normalize the whole concept of honesty throughout the therapeutic relationship. Whether or not there's a claim, that brutal honesty is respect for the patient all the way down the line, and to normalize that and just have it be part of the muscle memory is really important, because otherwise we are nothing more than transactional.
Thank you. Our second question, and we'll start with you, Evan. What's the most underappreciated return on investment of the CRP process, and why does it get overlooked?
Well, this is a tough one, Tom, because I think sometimes health systems are looking for, quick wins, early return on investment, where sometimes the justification for even doing CRP is thought of as a cost savings. And I would say that the most underappreciated return on investment is really this is a long-term play. This is not only doing the right thing for our patients. The data out of the Betsy Lehman Center that really showed that when patients who received good communication about what happened after a harm event, that they had like 50% less depression and anxiety, and they retained trust in the health system For a health system, I think they need to understand that this is a long-term play. It's about creating better care in the future. It's about retaining trust for patients, which in terms of a return on investment only adds to the equity of an organization where there's better care, therefore there's lower costs from all other complications in the future, and you're retaining trust in your patients as a respected healthcare provider in the community.
Thank you. Rick, what are people overlooking when it comes to ROI of CRPs?
I would say two. There are two different measures. One is the price tag on avoidable mistakes. I can go around the country and ask risk managers this question: how much did you spend in medical malpractice last year? And they can tell me to the penny. They can almost never answer the second question: how much should you have spent? Because not every one of those patients is undeserving. If you can't answer that question, you can't know with what business imperative you should be plowing more resources into quality and safety. By making a principled decision and then coming up with those with that measure, it really changes the business decision making. The second ROI that is often overlooked is the value that the healthcare staff finds in this approach, and the reassurance that they're working for a principled organization and an organization that will understand and do the right thing across the board. That has an enormous impact. We surveyed the University of Michigan faculty. We had over 480 responses, and it was overwhelming. The number of people who said they wanted to stay at the university, that this was a significant reason for keeping them there. So I think those two things are the things that I think are underappreciated.
Thank you. Carole, from the patient and family perspective, what's being missed about the ROI here?
Tom, I think if you look at any organization's mission, visions, value, they always say something about the patient in it. And what they're missing is, if you don't have programs like this, then are you really following your mission, vision, value of your organization?
That's great. And our last question, we'll start with you, Rick. What's the most important thing an organization should know if it's considering implementing a CRP? Rick?
That there is not a single report of an organization that had the financial ceiling fall in by doing this. We have believed that for decades, maybe 100 years, that we can't afford to be honest. There is no evidence to support that at all. And the ultimate benefit of doing this far exceeds whatever worries you have financially.
Carole, what is your thought? What's the most important thing an organization should know about CRP?
That you have to involve the patient and family in the process in creating your program. We're the end users, and we can give you guidance, direction, advice on how to do this. So if you think you can do it without involving patients and families, you're going to miss something along the way.
Great. And Evan, what's the most important thing folks need to know about CRP before going down this road?
Well, I'll add one thing to what Rick said. Not only is there's no evidence that we don't see an avalanche of new claims and expenses as a result. There's now good published data to show what happens when organizations implement consistently CRP, and all the benefits that we've been talking about actually occur. I would say the most important thing to consider is that of all the organizations that I've interacted with who have put in successful CRP programs, have said, this was a fundamental change in how we thought about harm and how we thought about malpractice. And we're never going back to that old way of deny and defend. This is the right thing, and it makes us feel good, and it makes patients feel good. And we have become a different place as a result of it, and we're not going back.
We love tough questions. I hope all of you are thinking of your tough questions, and we'll start typing them momentarily. But I'd like Carole to share some closing thoughts before we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Carole?
Thanks. I'm not interested in whether you stood with the great. I'm interested in whether you sat with the broken. I want you to think about your organization right now and where you are on the CRP process, whether you have nothing or you have it implemented. How would you rate your own organization? What would the providers and your staff think? But most importantly, what would your harm patients and families say? Next slide. I close with this. Rick brought out the importance that you have to have honesty, and you've got to have honesty first before transparency. We hear transparency being thrown around a lot out there. I will close with how my daughter would have looked at it if she was still alive. Transparency is like cellophane. What you see on one side, you see on the other. There's nothing hidden. There's no secrets. There's no silence. So thank you for engaging with us today. And now we want to answer your questions.
And we already have one from Florence LaCroix. Florence asks, what are some of the obstacles that you have experienced in your endeavor to implement CRP at various hospitals and healthcare systems? How did you surmount the obstacles? Rick, any opening thoughts on that particular question?
Thanks, Florence. I miss you. I think the biggest obstacle is to get clinical leaders to believe that this is really important to their larger mission. For too long, clinical leaders have just blindly deferred to the insurance and the legal professions without understanding that how injured people are treated really makes a big difference. And they need to value that first in order for the successful implementation to have a chance.
Evan, other thoughts about obstacles that you've seen and how you've overcome them?
I will say that leadership is so important here. I really believe that this needs to be, everyone needs to be engaged. All the frontline workers, the physicians, the folks in the quality, safety, risk departments. But it really has to be coming from leadership. It has to be coming from the top, because you're dealing with so many different departments. You're dealing with an approach. You're dealing with a med mal company that has to come on board to this philosophy. And I would say the biggest thing we can do in terms of overcoming the obstacles is having leaders who truly believe that this is the path forward.
That's great. And I would just add, you know, the status quo never develops by accident. The status quo develops because it serves powerful interests. So when you think about the status quo and the response to harm, you have to think carefully about, well, what interests does it serve, the status quo? How are they going to react as that becomes perturbed? And understanding what this new vision is and bringing stakeholders to rally behind that can be one part of overcoming the status quo. But without careful reflection about how did we end up here and whose interests are served, it's harder to move forward. Carole, did you want to share anything about obstacles?
The one thing I would say, Tom, is there's always the fear of the reactions from patients and families. And if I can dispel a myth, is right away everyone thinks a patient and family is angry. Their biggest thing they feel is guilt. They feel guilty they didn't do enough to protect their loved one. So I'm trying to educate that providers, organizations project their fears on the patient and family, what they're more afraid of. And it's to understand that our emotions aren't always this anger. We want to find a place to put this in our heart. And as we've said over and over again, to improve the care of the system.
That's a great question and great responses. Thank you, Florence. John O'Donnell has another outstanding question. How do we define unexpected? Whether an outcome is unexpected. Rick, you had decades experience doing this at Michigan. What was your definition of unexpected and how did you apply that?
Um, John, there is no question that that requires some judgment, and you're not always going to get it right. So we relied on caregivers basically to report. We relied on a host of other things. We had some evidence-based approaches, some billing approaches. For instance, if a patient was admitted through the emergency room to the floor and within 72 hours was transferred to an ICU, we had at least some reason to think that there was a problem in the initial assessment. There is no gold standard to that, but I would argue with the notion that this radically changes depending on whose eyes are looking at the case. For the most part, caregivers know when they really expected one outcome and something different happened. But I don't have a great answer for you there. And Tom, before I leave this question, I want to pick up on something that Florence asked, and that is, how do you get leadership on board? The one thing that I will say that is pretty effective is to have a discussion with the governing board. Because I can guarantee you that if you were to ask boards of directors, should we share or should we be honest with our patients who have had unanticipated clinical outcomes? Across the board, I've never been into a governing board that said, no, we shouldn't. We should be celebrating maybe cheating somebody. The message from governing boards to leadership determines what leadership prizes or works toward. There's a whole system of priorities, expectations, and rewards that get built corporately. One of the first things I look at when I go into an organization is exactly that. What is the clinical leadership being rewarded on, and what are the expectations implicit in those priorities and those sorts of things. But I don't think there's a one size fits all. There are some clinical leaders who get it. Evan Benjamin is a great example. He was so rare years ago in MACP that he was a clinical leader who understood the full import of this, not just a claims management strategy.
That's great, Rick. And Evan, Claudia wants to know, how are CRP programs implemented differently at organizations that are really committed to learning?
So you're distinguishing between just an organization committed to learning, or as opposed to a teaching hospital?
No, I think an organization that sort of is consciously trying to become a learning healthcare system.
Yeah. So for me, it's a natural extension of that learning health system. When you talk about what it's like to be in a learning health system, you're really talking about that the organization is trying to set norms around transparency and organizational learning, having good reporting systems, having good data, that with their open and honest conversations about performance throughout the organization, all around trying to get better, trying to use the real science of improvement. CRP is it's a natural extension of that. It's very clear. It adds to that learning. It's focused, of course, it's starting with harm and unexpected care, but it's just bringing the focus on harm and unexpected care through the learning systems which have been established. So an organization which has been committed to be a learning organization, they are very natural places to be very real leaders in doing CRP.
And I would just add, Evan and Rick and Leilani Schweitzer and I wrote a editorial in BMJ Quality and Safety a little while ago that really gets at this issue. Truly learning healthcare systems, when they adopt CRP, they make CRPs mission critical. They prioritize it as not a nice to have, not a very nice to have, but it's one of their top initiatives that really gets the resources, the leadership accountability, all that it needs to really succeed. Rick or Carole, any other thoughts about CRPs and learning healthcare organizations?
The only thing I would add, Tom, is I've forgotten the corporate truism, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Any health organization can do this tomorrow. And you can start small and start to build a sense of experience, but just start. You'll be shocked at how rewarding it is, and you will be shocked at how all of your preconceived notions turn out to be really false about how patients behave. I have seen some of the most remarkable, transcendent moments from patients who were harmed, who were more worried about the caregivers than they were about their own prosecuting their own harm going forward. It's incredible what happens when you give patients a chance.
Great, Rick. And Brian, great question. Are state level protections necessary? They can be helpful, but they're not necessary. We see CRPs thriving in a variety of states with different levels of legal protection or not legal protections. And in part, it gets back to Rick's point, which is an interested organization can start this tomorrow. And so the state legal protections are nice, but not critical. I'd like to close with the question that Cheryl asks. Under what circumstances do you recommend referring a patient or family to counsel during the CRP process? Carole, do you mind just sharing a little bit from the patient and family perspective? Do you have thoughts about the role of a plaintiff attorney in the CRP process?
I think they should have someone, one, because oftentimes, depending where they are in this process, they don't have the right frame of mind. You know, there still may be grieving, suffering. And I think to have someone there, it shows the validity and it shows the equity of, you know, it's not just an organization and here's the patient. So I believe that there should be that person there representing the patient. And the whole goal is to have those honest and forthright conversations.
Rick, thoughts about the role of plaintiff attorneys?
I think there's a big misconception on the defense side of things that having a plaintiff's lawyer is going to be counterproductive. It is exactly the opposite. I will say, hands down, the last thing I wanted was an amateur. And the last thing I wanted was a patient who I had to worry about every step of the way was feeling taken advantage of. Now, that being said, there were patients who, I had one man, I was not even sure he was literate, but he said to me one day, I am not separating or splitting my recovery by a third with a plaintiff's lawyer. I learned later he had 4 different lawyers all counseling him behind the scenes. The point is, you have to be respectful. There are some circumstances where you must have a lawyer. You've got to have a lawyer in the cases of minors. You've got to have a lawyer, I think, in the cases of death cases. But in general, the plaintiff's bar has risen to this in ways that even I was surprised. So we always told everybody, we will not treat you differently if you're represented. And in fact, we're happy to give you a list of plaintiffs' lawyers who are A-rated lawyers and who have worked collaboratively or creatively and constructively with us in the past.
It's so wonderful, and many thanks to Carole and Evan and Rick.